so Vasco Medeiros, I do not know him, so he's not one of us here from CIUHCT. He was recommended by Henrique, that argued that also Professor Vitor Serrão liked him a lot, so he probably was like he had positive opinions from both our scientists and or historians of science and historians of art, so that he was doing something that was also in between, and it is also related with cartography. So he's going to talk about artifacts Ars Cartographica, collaboration between Portuguese painters and cartographers in the 15th and 16th centuries, and he's professor of the Institute for Culture and Portuguese Language of the Faculty of Letters of the University of Lisbon, and he's an integrated researcher of Artis, so the Institute for the History of Art of the Faculty of Humanities of the University of Lisbon. So I think, well, it will be like a follow-up of this talk. So I think without further delays, Vasco.
I hope so. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, Anna. It's a great responsibility. Can I share? I cannot share the screen. You have to let me share the screen. No, it's not working. I cannot share the screen. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes. Can you try again?
Yes.
Because you are a co-host.
It's disabled. The screen share.
Dois Vascos Medeiros, mas acho que já.
Ah, yes. I have two screens. Maybe
okay.
that's the problem. Okay. It's not that Vasco. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Anna. This paper is called Artifacts Art Cartographica, as you said, and it's part of an ongoing project of artists recently founded by FCT that aims to discuss the relationship between Portuguese painters and cartographers in the 15th and 16th century. A cartographer, a mathematician, and a painter walk into a bar. The joke lies in the fact that in the 15th and 16th centuries, all these characters could appear concentrated in one man. There are plenty of examples of this versatility. Filippo Brunelleschi, Leon Battista Alberti, Piero della Francesca, Leonardo da Vinci, Albrecht Dürer, to name only the best known. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the formal complicity between these activities was so obvious that it would be difficult to discern where one ended and the other began. This overlapping of skills is due to the fact that cartography and painting of modern age actually have a common origin. Their union stems for several discoveries and novelties that in the first 3 decades of the 15th century would definitively change the way of understanding and representing the world. The rediscovery and reception of Ptolemy and Vitruvius, the advent of Flemish optical painting and topographic realism, and the advent of Perspectiva Artificialis and subsequent mathematization of reality. From the combination of all these elements emerge 4 models of visual and cartographic representation that definitively characterize the Quattrocento and Cinquecento as a moment of real discovery of the world. The detailed representation of landscape and city profiles, the aerial images known as bird-eye view, the planimetric images or vertical surveys of houses, cities, or regions, and the pictorial representation of the great novelty constituted by the discovery of the other. In order to understand the nature of these innovations and the reception in a kingdom as peripheral as Portugal, it is important to first analyze the common genesis of the two of the most relevant activities of the modern age, painting and cartography. In the early decades of the 15th century, Italy was experiencing a period full of great and impressive novelties, Ptolemy and Vitruvius. Ptolemy geography, an innovative model inspired by the so-called projection of Marino of Tyre, had been received in Italy since the end of the 14th century by the Greek Emmanuel Chrysoloras and his disciple Jacobus d'Angelus, both responsible for its Latin translation in 1406. The reception of this work by scholarly, but also operative and workshop circles would decisively revolutionize art through the inclusion of three innovative concepts: the division of the world into a network of meridians and parallels, the suggestion of various methods to project them onto a flat surface, the method of observation from a central point. Taken together, they will be fundamental for Filippo Brunelleschi to develop his famous experience at the gates of Basilica of Santa Maria del Fiore around 1413 and conceptually invent the Perspectiva Artificialis. Martin Kemp had other factors that also contributed to the development of scientific perspective, namely the use of Vitruvian-inspired surveying techniques, the use of scientific instruments such as the quadrant and the astrolabe for measuring visual angles, and the reception of medieval optical science called perspective. Taken together, they seem to affirm an inescapable fact, namely the common genesis between modern cartography and perspective. All these scattered elements will be written down in the form of treatises by the prominent humanist Leon Battista Alberti. If the De Pictura, written in 1435, will take on the honors of theorizing Brunelleschi's experimental foundations, it will fall to the Ludi Mathematici of 1450 to depict them theoretically. Furthermore, there are two aspects that allow us to intuit the direct influence of geography in the Albertian method of the Construzione Legittima. The introduction of a virtual network of meridians and parallels in the pictorial space of the works, the famous pavimenti, and the recommendation of the use of velo, that is, a virtual window that allowed the rigorous delineation of landscapes, people, and objects through a centralized point of view. These two innovations demonstrate Alberti's understanding of a geometric problem common to painting and cartography and related to optical issues associated with vision. For in reality, one does not perceive space, but rather the objects that fill it. The introduction of mathematics into the semantics of art will thus be significant for the paradigm shift of the artist of the Quattrocento, and already seems to foreshadow the future complicity between cartography and the art of painting. In fact, it is significant that in 1433, 2 years before the publication of De Pictura, Alberti produced precisely a treatise dedicated to the topographical survey of Rome entitled Descriptio Urbis Roma, where he speaks precisely of the use of an instrument useful both for cartography and painting. And I quote, "I want to speak now of a certain instrument, apt, as you yourselves will see, for these matters, and even more so for those who use the trabuco and similar warlike machines. I use them for much more pleasant things, like measuring the dimensions of a village or painting a landscape, as I did when I portrayed Rome," end of quote. This passage proves unequivocally that the existing instrumentation for cartography survey, whether for architectural or military purposes, was also known and commonly used by painters. It should be noted that one of the most interesting aspects of the whole Albertian treatise body is that the interlocutors of his works have diverse intellectual and social backgrounds. The simultaneous theoretical and experimental character of the Descriptio, the De Pictura, and the Ludi Mathematici clearly shows the presence of a trading zone frequented by people from diverse areas of intervention, of distinct intellectual training and social levels. The proof of this lies in the plurality of Alberti's extensive network of friendship and contacts, an intricate web made up of nobles, cardinals, mathematicians, and artists. The epistemic model was thus created, and its expansion to all the courts of Europe, even the most peripheral, such as Portugal, would not be long in coming. Before going on, however, to characterize the national scene, it is important to analyze the second great discovery that will be fundamental for the development of painting and cartography, the advent of Flemish optical painting and the so-called topographic realism. Erwin Panofsky characterized in a curious way the division of competencies that occurred in this respect precisely between Flanders and Italy. Invokes a classic fairy tale about two brothers who separately possess a magic spyglass and a rifle. One can see the dragon but cannot kill it, the other can kill it but cannot see it. It will be difficult to find another analogy that so clearly illustrates the division of skills between mathematicians, cartographers, and painters. The topographical realism descends directly from Dutch optical naturalism and was developed in the first 3 decades of the 15th century by master of Boucicaut, the Lambourg brothers, and Jan van Eyck. If the celebrated work Les Traits Riches, painted between 1411 and 1416, constitutes a crucial advance for the advent of topographical realism, it is Jan van Eyck, however, who was formed a European school in the true sense of the term. Its direct relation with the advent of modern cartography is, moreover, attested to by the chroniclers of the time. Indeed, Bartolomeu Fazio, who called him the most important painter of our age, stated that Van Eyck painted a globe which he describes as the most perfect work of our time, on which one can distinguish not only the places and continents, but also the distances which separate them, end of quote. If the presence of this globe allows us to intuit what David Busseret classifies as a painter who observed the world in cartographic terms, the founding landscape of the Virgin of Chancellor Rollin, realized in bird's eye view and endowed with unique details, clearly confirms it. The sophistication of this landscape, painted precisely in 1435, the year Alberti's De Pictura was completed, definitively closes the cycle of improvements in European painting and cartography in the first half of the 15th century. As might be expected, and like its European counterparts, the reception of Flemish naturalism, Italian perspective, and modern cartography also took place under the strong wing of royal patronage in Portugal. The peripheral nature of our kingdom may naturally suggest that this reception was late, but it should be noted that this perception is illusory, since in fact the destiny of some of the players named here intersects directly or indirectly with Portugal. Jan van Eyck, painter and ambassador of Philip III, Duke of Burgundy, will be in Portugal between December 1428 and October 1429. And Fernando Martins, secretary of Nicholas of Cusa and close friend of Toscanelli and Alberti, returns to Lisbon in 1467. These two events, when compared with the maritime progression of the Portuguese in the South Atlantic, may contain some hitherto ignored meanings, but which we believe are certainly relevant. Let us go in parts. In the travel diary of Philip the Good embassy to Portugal, we come across a rather unusual event. In mid-January 1429, Jan van Eyck painted a portrait of Infanta Isabel in Navis in the presence of her brothers Duarte, Pedro, Henrique, João, and Fernando, and her half-brother Afonso, Count of Barcelos. Given Bartolomeu's Fazio information that Van Eyck had worked as a cartographer and had painted the globe with extreme detail and precision, the questions arise. Was it painted before or after his presence at the court of Avis? If before, did he give technical training to the court painters and cartographers? If later, did the famous painter have access to any similar specimen in Avis, Lisbon, or Sintra? These are questions that we will unfortunately have to leave open, but which, given the chronology, are bound to provoke some thoughts. As for the second issue, that is the return of Canon Fernando Martins to Lisbon, 3 years after the death of Nicholas of Cusa in August 1464, the same year that Prince Henry died, also seems to have special significance. This question might be minor were it not for the fact that Nicholas of Cusa also devoted himself to cartography. It is known that around 1450, he drew one of the first maps of Germany using the Duarte. It is also known that in one of his last works, Compendium, written in 1463, he compared the human intellect to a geographer living in a city with 5 gates. In his metaphor, he receives information from all over the world through the 5 gates of senses. And I quote, at length, after he has made in his city a complete delineation of the perceptible world, then in order not to lose it, he reduces it to a well-ordered and proportionally measured map, end of quote. Is there a better metaphor for the city of Lisbon in the mid-15th century? And is it plausible to think that Fernando Martins, Cusa's secretary between 1458 and 1464, and certainly with cartographic knowledge, was completely unaware of the kingdom's foreign policy? Not very likely. We know that in 1474, he was still living in Lisbon and exchanging letters with the mathematician, astronomer, and geographer Paulo Toscanelli. We must therefore consider that the memories of his meeting with Cusa, Alberti, and Toscanelli certainly constituted one of the central topics of discussion in the trading zone formed during the reign of King Afonso V, with inevitable impacts on both the artistic and cartographic policy of the kingdom. It is a fact that Portugal was living in exceptional times, since never before in the history of mankind had there been such a sudden discovery of the world and such an urgent need to measure and to represent it. This perception suggests that pictorial and cartographic production in the kingdom during the second half of the 15th century was abundant. The reality, however, betrayed this expectation. In fact, the strong erosion of both Portuguese painting and cartography in the second half of the 15th century suggests a strange similarity between the two activities. No substantial traces exist before the 70s or of the 15th century. In painting, we are left only with the famous panels of São Vicente, painted by Nuno Gonçalves around 1470, and in cartography, the famous chart of Modena, made by an anonymous Portuguese cartographer somewhere in 1471. Both the panels and the chart seems to manifest an undeniable sophistication and traces of their own identity. Taken together, they allow us to intuit that in the 70s of the 15th century, there was a modernization of both painting and cartography in Portugal. It is true that the analysis of the pictorial and cartographic collection produced between 1450 and 1500 would allow us to retrace a large part of the history of art and cartography in Portugal, with results that are absolutely surprising and really revealing on an European scale. Its absence, however, leaves us with more questions than certainties, but on which it is important to reflect. First, what was the content of the relations between cartographers and painters? Second, how did the epistemic exchange between these two activities take place? Third, did painters participate in the decoration of maps and atlases? And finally, were there any painters on board the ships? On the presence of painters on board the ships and given the complexity of some iconographic elements, Helen Wallis is clear in affirming that yes. This statement, however, in addition to lacking obvious documental support, raises a number of questions. In fact, were these painters responsible only for the pictorial, ethnographic, and landscape record of the new territories discovered, or were they also cartographers following the tradition of some of the names already mentioned? There are obvious examples that attest to the practice of landscape recording as a complement to the cartographic survey, and that allow us to assume that Alan Wallace is right. The famous Tábua da Aguada do Cheque, painted by Dom João de Castro in 1541, proves that the Flemish topographic realism was common practice on board the Portuguese ships. As to the third question about the participation of painters in the decoration of maps and atlases, the collaboration in 1519 between Lopo Homem, Pedro Reinel, Jorge Reinel, and the illuminator António de Holanda in the production of the famous Atlas Miller is well known. The images produced by Holanda are impressive and detailed and suggest a marked concern to characterize iconographically each of the regions represented. We owe to him some of the most expressive topographical records of the kingdom, admirably put into an aerial perspective, whose rigor and detail might even suggest the use of the aforementioned Albertian vellum. The degree of iconographic details in Miller Atlas suggests that he had observed some specimens from various territories represented in Lisbon. This practice is clearly proven by Vasco Fernando's Adoration and by the Inferno from the Museu Nacional de Arte Antiga. Painted at the beginning of the 16th century, the Adoration shows us in an ethnographic detail a Tupinambá Indian certainly observed live when Gaspar Lemos returned to the kingdom to communicate the news of the discovery of Brazil. A comparison of Miller's atlas with some of the decorative elements of the atlas of Lázaro Luís, Fernão Vaz Dourado, or Sebastião Lopes allow us to clearly understand the difference between a work resulting from the partnership between cartographers and painters and others illuminated by cartographers on the basis of conventional elements. The late dates of these works suggest that sometime during the first half of the 16th century, there was a definite separation between the two activities, resulting in a gradual autonomy of the cartographers. This idea, when compared with the inventory of painters and cartographers active in the kingdom between 1450 and 1600, reveals that there was in fact a change in the priorities and specialization of craftsmen. In the works Trabalhos Náuticos dos Portugueses and Notícia de alguns pintores portugueses by Sousa Viterbo, we can find the record of 131 painters, illuminators, cartographers, and builders of nautical instruments between 1434 and 1598. Of this universe, 97 are painters, illuminators, and draftsmen, and 34 are cartographers, cosmographers, builders of nautical instruments, and mathematicians. The interesting point to retain from this data is related to its chronological distribution. In fact, if the second largest register of painters in the service of the kingdom, just after the reign of Manuel I, occurs in the period between 1434 and 1485, the register of cartographers starts only from 1512. This seems to suggest that during the reign of Afonso V, some painters could indeed have been cartographers, but as the charts, maps, and atlas became more and more complex, they gave way to increasingly specialized craftsmen. The inexistence of painting and nautical charts from this period makes it impossible for the moment to give a concrete answer on this subject. Through this clarification, we hope to be able to answer another important question about the teaching process of epistemic exchanges between painters and cartographers. Did cartographers teach perspective to painters? Did painters teach pictorial optics to cartographers? This is the big question. We know the names of all of them, and we even know that at the beginning of the 16th century, they were grouped by family workshops. We also know that they shared a number of skills and complicities. They all made use of geometry and mathematics in the construction of their works and sought to represent the world with extreme fidelity through pictorial optics. Together, they were integrated into a small group called Artifacts Polytechnics, which was composed of versatile and highly specialized theoreticians, technicians, and craftsmen. It is therefore to be expected that whenever a cartographer and a painter met somewhere in Lisbon at the dawn of the 16th century, the content of their conversation was vast as the immensity of the world to be discovered. Thank you so much.
Let me.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasco.
Okay.
So it was in fact more about painters and illuminators than so much about cartographers as in the others. Yes, very well. Okay, so are there any questions? Well, if not, I have one, because I would like to know how you can separate so clearly painters from illuminators and from the other artisans, because I have this idea that many of them are hybrid. They do a lot of things.
Now, it's a question of the technique they use. Illuminators use tempera, and painters at some time start to use oil painting. And this is the moment, the shift moment for the transformation of painting and to the achievement of an optical pictorial new reality. It's more a technical issue than a capacity, because they all have the knowledge to work with different techniques.
Okay. So are there any other questions? Now I have one question from Francisco that was from, it was, where is it, the question from Francisco? Francisco, please, if you are there. Francisco, I have lost the question. Francisco.
Francisco was asking, I can read his question.
Okay, thank you, please.
He points out that Joaquin and Henrique wrote about nautical charts and geographical maps belonging to two paradigms. And he asks whether artistic senses of cartographers and geographers bring these documents together, perhaps hindering the understanding of their purposes. As for me, I don't have a good answer on that. I think that the restrictions, the formal restrictions on nautical charts, it's a bit different than on geographical maps. So I'm not so sure, but it is a good question.
Okay. Does anyone?
I want to ask also Vasco, and I hope I didn't miss this at the beginning of the conversation because I had to leave for a moment. Whether you found any, whether the evidence for collaborations that you encountered between illuminators and cartographers, were you finding mainly documental evidence or stylistic evidence? What kind of evidence have you encountered? And I deeply apologize if I missed a discussion of this earlier on.
Yes, well, the project, the Artifacts project aims to create a database, visual database, related to art history of small details, as architectural details, anatomical, vegetable details in nautical charts and in paintings.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, and so we will try to find some matches. What we call in art history the same hand.
Yeah, or the same ear, like Morelli.
Yes, yes.
I understand you perfectly. So something stylistic, characteristic.
Exactly. We have now kind of 1,600 names classified. Now we will start to put all the images and visual information in that database to try to find some matches, because it's important and interesting to discover if that relation it's more clear than what we expect now. We know that some painters like Antonio de Holanda, it's only the only reference that we have, but probably we have more artists and more collaboration.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have because, as I've shown in the presentation, we have a lot of painters at the second half of the 15th century, but we don't have their works. They have disappeared. And we don't have nautical charts from that time also. But at the start of the 16th century, I guess that we will find some matches in that kind of decorative elements.
The thing that's really difficult, which it's always a struggle for me, and maybe this approach that you're applying where you try to find painter matches could be very powerful, is the fact that you can't really compare very readily the style of the cartographic elements, for example, in nautical charts, like the style of a coastline or the style of handwriting with the style of miniature. It's different genre. You can't make an easy match, right? So maybe this approach you're taking is going to unlock some doors in determining when there's a collaboration and when not.
That's not a technical approach. It's an artistic approach.
Yeah, exactly.
It's different, and it's easier to find some matches, because in painting we usually use the same method, for example, in paintings and prints.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the system, and I hope that we will find a lot of matches, new information.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Joaquin, there is another question.
It's just a short note to add my 2 cents to answer the question of